4 countries, the US, Korea, Japan, and Indonesia, control more than 80% of the exports of rice. So imagine if there is a climate change shock, a climate shock in any of these countries, automatically the price will drop. And that's exactly what happened in 2007-2008. If you remember, the rice price spiked enormously. Okay? So what will be the solution to this type of problem is I need to increase my portfolio. Right now my portfolio is too concentrated. I need to find a way to increase the production in different areas, especially if I am facing a scenario of climate change that increases volatility. Because that means that I could have a shock in any of these regions, that if all my exports are focused in that region, then automatically I will have a problem. Another option is to create a mechanism of reserve. Asian plus 3 in Asia for rice, they have agreed to create a physical reserve, and the trigger mechanism is a climate trigger. So if there is any climate shock in that area, they will automatically. It's very difficult for me at the country level to resolve a problem which is at the level of the world. And the idea that I can accumulate reserves at the country level to resolve the global problem is not feasible. A little bit. Now, what is the problem? We'll go in detail in that. But basically, when you have users, it's a problem for consumers and could also open a window. So we need to be very careful with the issue of volatility. And we also need to be very careful on how to measure and to understand volatility. Price levels is not volatility. Okay? I could have prices going down and high volatility. Okay, I could have prices going up and low volatility. So we need to differentiate. Volatility is a change in prices. Okay? PT minus 1 over PT minus 1. That's what I care in terms of volatility. And it's incredible, but wherever you go in the world, you will hear the most important people in the most important agencies in the world talking about volatility when they are really talking about price levels. Okay, and I'm being very honest. Everywhere people talk about volatility, and they are really talking about price levels. So prices going up doesn't mean high volatility. Now, what is what we need to improve? And that's where I think AGRODEP members could play a significant role. Is that we need to improve food security for the poor in developing countries, that's for sure, in many of your countries. Understanding how the key drivers impact food supply, demand, or both. As I mentioned before, climate change plays a role. The competition of water, modeling water is very important. Modeling natural resources is very important. And we need to identify policies that can increase resilience for food, for the poor system, for the poor people through the food system. So we need to start thinking progressively in this mechanism to increase productivity in larger areas and to find ways to cope with this increase in volatility because of climate change. Like weather-based index insurance, for example. How we can improve over those so that we increase the uptake rate, given that right now it's pretty low. Let me go through only a simple drawing. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But basically what we try to do in this simple drawing is try to bring all the drivers that we think are behind price volatility, and it's very linked to the topics that we're trying to bring up through AGRODEP. So clearly you have your domestic demand and your domestic food supply, okay? And you define your domestic prices. But if you are an import country or an exporting country, the international food prices will affect you, of course. Okay? Now, how those international prices are defined? They are basically based on oil prices in certain way. There is some relationship with oil prices. There is some relationship with the spot prices that could be influenced with future prices, and we will show that basically we identify that spot prices are greater caused by future prices. So if I have a lot of liquidity here, I could influence the spot prices and I could influence the international price. There is also the link with climate change and environment. If there is any shock in the climate that will affect because of how concentrated is the market. But also this creates competition for water management and trade liberalization, for sure, is what we call a secondary effect. No? If you remember in 2007, 2008, many countries, as a result of what was happening with the prices, immediately closed and put barriers to export. Okay? And some countries tried to profit from it, like Argentina, which increased the export tax. It was a huge source of revenue. And what that does in such a concentrated world market is immediately help to increase the prices. So the worry when Russia put the ban was, oh my God, if not only Russia puts the ban, which is 11% of exports, but other countries follow, then it could really have created a positive turn. Okay? But know that this is a response of countries. It's a policy tool that countries have to be able to respond. And it could have difficult consequences, especially if you are an important exporting country in the world. Now, what are the information needs and what information exists? Okay? And this is linked to the data component of AGRODEP, because there we want to bring as much as information we can in different topics, no? Behind that framework. So you have a system of FAO which is called Global Information and Early Warning System. These are the use. And many countries of Africa have a system in place. So when there is an alert, they will give an alert system, and then, for example, WFP can come into play and provide assistance through their own mechanism. So there is a database on the global, regional, national level, and they try to bring certain indicators to alert of a food security problem in the country, a food security emergency. Then you have the food security information for joint action between EC and FAO, which is called the FCA. You have the FAO stat, which is the global source of price information. That's their mandate. They are supposed to provide information of prices. You have the famine early warning system, which is called FuseNet. And then you have a system which is more country level, which is called FSMS and PBIMS and VAM, which is from WFP's system. Today, they are trying to join all these mechanisms in something called AIMS. Okay? AIMS is a new idea that came from the G20 that is trying to bring in all the data information and trying to identify the gaps. Okay? Because clearly there are significant gaps. The gaps were even worse in the 2007-2008. I don't know if you recall, but there was nothing when the 2007-2008 crisis started. Very little information on prices, especially within the country. Okay? It was very difficult to identify what was the transmission within Ethiopia, for example, of the changes in prices, within Uganda, within Kenya. There was very little data at the sub-regional level within each country, and very little data for some African countries. That has changed a little bit now. The FAO stats now have data at the country level, and you can see the data within the country. The same with the FuseNet. You have better information at the sub-country level. Okay, but clearly there were gaps. The gaps now are more on the analysis of the data, and of course in getting better data and longer time series of the data. So what are the main gaps that we are finding? First, there was a clear gap on forecasting extreme values. These enormous jumps in returns. Okay? Nobody was able to try to model this. Not to model the price. To model the price in the short term is very difficult. We can model the evolution of the price in the long term, 25th, 23rd. But to model a price today or next week or 1 month from here, that's close to impossible because there is a huge stochastic component. But what you can try to model is when these price abnormalities will happen, okay? And try to understand what is behind. There is very little still information on price transmission. And one of the topics that you will hear today is on price transmission. And how we can measure that and what are the techniques to measure price transmission. And there was little understanding of the effects of price changes. We have improved a lot on that. Normally when I am in these talks and my colleagues come and present, they normally come with the argument, okay, in the 70s, in the 80s, we have the same level of prices. I think that the biggest difference today is that we know who we are affecting today because of those changes in prices. In the 70s, we didn't have the household level data that we have today. So today it's easier for us to clearly identify how many people move into poverty and how I am shifting the distribution to the left. Okay? Because that could imply less calorie consumption and could have long-term effects. So if I am aware of the effects of those changes in prices, I better do something to resolve it because our lives involved. And the other group of tools which needs to be improved is policy analysis support tools. So build capacities at the country level. Normally all these international agencies like FAO, what they will do is they will collect data at the country level. But the statistical units at the country level needs to keep the same level of standards to be able to have continuous data. Okay, in trade we have the problem we don't have social accounting metrics, we don't have IO tables and data. It's the same in prices. Because if I want to put all these data in the same standards, I need to have a system in place at the country level to be able to use it. And the same for tracking of food policies. The advantages we have from the 2007-2008 is that there were so many policies implemented at the country level that right now we can track them and see which were the best practices, which were the wrong practices, and why they were good or they were bad. So that will allow us to identify which are best and bad practices in the market. Any question up to that? Any question? Yes?
It's just about the consequences of the price changes on the consumption side. Because you create some
and one of the sessions we will do an exercise with that. Miguel Robles will present on how we estimate the welfare effects and how we take the small price elasticity and elasticity of substitution. Now, sadly, in some countries, like if I take, for example, Central America, okay, the tortilla is one of the main staples they eat, okay, which is based on wheat or pork. So they are very inelastic to change. So the elasticity of substitution is close to zero. I assume in some areas of Africa it's similar in some of the specific commodities. And the problem is when that commodity is dependent on international price, because sometimes the commodity is self-consumed and then you are not going to be affected. And you will see in corn, for example, in some countries, we don't see any effect of international prices because they're self-consumed. Okay? And that's what most of the analysis didn't capture before. They immediately assume full price transmissions to producers and to consumers. And that was a big mistake.
So, I'm just thinking about, if one looks at the theory of growth, especially business cycles, it can give us an insight in terms of where we have coincident indicators, leading indicators, and lagging indicators. For instance, an indicator could proxy within the next 3 months how the other indicator is going to behave. And if you can identify an indicator that is a leading indicator, it tells you that if this indicator peaks now, in the next 3 months, the other indicator which is leading is likely to peak. You may not be correct, but it gives you an indication of likelihood of that particular variable peaking.
Yeah, there is a whole literature on leading and lagging indicators. No?
Yeah.
And there is, at the country level, there is a possibility to be able to capture them. But remember, these prices are international. Okay? So if your price depends on types of products, then you need to identify those leading and lagging indicators at the global level. That's not an easy job. Now, what you can do always is work with lags. Okay? And Carlos will explain how we model this. So we already have a model that is performing pretty well to identify spikes. Because the lags, what will tell you is, okay, what was the history accumulated to get that into that price? And you can use PT minus 1, PT minus 2, PT minus 3, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing that we're trying to bring additional to that is behavioral change on the spot. So between PT minus 1 and today, there could be something else that is affecting prices. And we're trying to find something to do that, like, for example, media, how media is affecting prices. But it's very important. And I will show you an example why media is so important today. Okay? But what you are saying is something that normally countries will do at the country level. So I used to work models for beer industry, for example. And to look at the prices of inputs, normally we will work with some leading indicators so that we can forecast how to perform. Yeah. Any other comment, question? Okay, so let's move to the problems of inadequate information. And remember, I'm talking at the global level, okay? And I can continue talking, no problem. The first big issue is that we don't talk about climate change. Okay, that's a problem. We are not integrating climate change changes in variation, in variability, as I mentioned, to the model of price. That's something that we need to look because it could be very important in the long term. Okay, not only in the long term, but it's already important. Now, of course, there is an issue in the climate change literature that is being discussed in the other parallel sessions, is how we make these scenarios, the multiple scenarios, to at least get into a consensus. At least seems to be two consensus at the global level. There will be more water, okay, and there will be more variability in temperature. Based on that, we need to figure out how we can work to be able to model prices better. The second one is what I mentioned before, the extreme value. And why it's so important? Because whatever mechanism you want to put to reduce volatility, you need to have a trigger. So if I am WFP and I want to say I am going to release reserves today, or if I am Asian plus free and the price of rice is going up and I want to release, I have to have a clear mechanism to identify when to release. When really price volatility is extreme that really means an intervention, because you really don't want to mess the market. You want to do an optimal intervention. And that is not an easy job. And in most of the countries which are developing stocks, at the national level, they don't think on when to release. And then it becomes very political. Okay? And you can really affect prices, because you are buying at a price and you want to release at a different price. And you can create significant distortions. And there is a lot of evidence on that. So we need to be very careful with the importance of this modeling of extreme values. The third one is the assumption of price transmission the same to consumers and producers. That's a big mistake. And tomorrow, Nick Minot will explain on this. And he will bring the analysis he did for Africa. He worked with 15 African countries and look into the price transmission at the sub-regional level within the country and from the global to the national level. Now, imagine how complex this is, because if you are a country, if you are your advisor for your Ministry of Finance, when you see an increase in international prices of rice, which could affect your internal price, you will start putting measures immediately. Like, for example, reduce the import taxes, okay? Which you can target to the commodity. And that will reduce the transmission. So it's an endogenous result of a process, okay? So we need to be very careful to be able to measure this price transmission. Then, assuming that the effect in terms of changes in poverty, most of the analysis were there this amount of new poor people. But sorry, it's not only the counts. The counts are not so big sometimes. We are talking of countries with 2 points more of poverty and so on. But if you look at the distribution, the shift of the distribution to the left, meaning that they consume less, is significant. So 70, 80, 90% of the distribution got affected, especially if you are in the lower deciles, in the poorest deciles of the distribution. Okay? So looking at the whole distribution is very important, and not only looking at the point estimate of the count of poverty. The other thing was this lack of linkages between the futures and the spot. And many people were assuming that what happens in the future market doesn't affect in certain way the spot market. And finally, the interlinkages of exchanges. And why that is very important is because one of the measures the world is really pushing today is regulation of exchanges. Okay? So what are the key exchanges? The New York Exchange, the Chicago, Exchange, the Kansas Exchange, the British one, the French, the South African one, okay? The Chinese. I think those are the key ones. If I am going to regulate an exchange and not regulate the others, then the probability that I will be successful is very low. Because when I close a door here, then people will go through the others. Okay? And that's what we try to show here. And many of the countries in the world today are trying to push for regulation. And what is the problem of regulation? Is that you basically reduce liquidity of this market. So if you want to do a transaction in the futures market and you have to pay more or to put more cash in advance to do a transaction, that will reduce the amount of transactions in the market. It increases the cost. If I reduce the number of transactions, I reduce liquidity. And today, one of the things that we need most in this sector is liquidity. Okay? So just blindly regulating in this world seems to be very important, very problematic. So we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful how to regulate the exchanges on that topic. Okay, so let me go one by one in terms of the topics that have been mentioned so that you can look at the facts. First, climate change. Just the case of maize, there are many scenarios. I just want to bring an example. Global production seems to be, the scenario that we are working on, there could be a reduction of 16% in terms of global production. And the intensity of the color tells you more or less in which areas that reduction will happen. What that means in terms of prices, basically, using this type of climate change scenario, Mark Rosman has simulated what will be the change in prices in different commodities. And the one that you need to look is to the yellow one, which basically is telling you what will be the level of prices, dollars per metric ton, when we include the climate change scenario. And the red one is when we don't include the climate change scenario for 2050. So clearly climate change seems to be having an effect over prices. And if we look to volatility, even the effect will be more important given the concentration of the market. In terms of extreme values, Carlos will go in detail into that. And you cannot see more these slides, which will put the PowerPoints on the videos. But basically, he will explain in detail how this is being modeled. But let me give you just a motivation to the problem, okay? This is when the Russian fires happen, okay? These are an example, a subsample of the media that appeared in that point in time. If you read that all these media, New York Times, no wheat shortage, but prices may rise. Russia grain export ban sparks price fears. Wheat prices soar after the Russian bans on exports. All of them were basically a cut and paste of what happened in 2007-2008. All of them were telling the world, because of Russian bans, we are going into an enormous price spike. And that was completely wrong, because there were enough stocks and enough production, as I will show in a few minutes. So basically this was the evolution. This is when the announcement of the export bans, look how it spiked, but it immediately went down automatically. Later on there were other reports, like the USDA report that show a reduction in yields, which created a little spike. But imagine this difference. If I am a country and I go and immediately rush and import because I think it will continue increasing, I could create a significant problem internally. Okay? Now, why is this important? Is because if we look at the production, there was enough production in that period. Even more, if we look at the stocks and compare to 2007-2008, discounting what was lost, whatever, we had enough stocks in that point in time. So there was no reason for that price to spike. It was just basically information that was wrongly delivered, and there was lack of information on what was there in the market. And this was a surprise. We were getting calls from several countries asking what was the situation, aside from the media, of course. Now, if we use the model that we have put in place, so this is the graph, and Carlos will explain this. The red line is what we call the 95 percentile. So it's the extreme value that we assume, 95 percentile. So that your price or your change in returns is over the red line means that there is 5% of probability that that will happen. Very low probability. Okay, if it is under, there is high probability. That's why it's called extreme value. Okay. Now, if I do assume for the time of the Russian crisis, look what happened. All are over the 95 percentile. So if you were in New York Times and you call me that day, I will tell you the price will go down tomorrow. And the price went down, the change in return, the price went down the next day. So at that point we were the only ones saying the price will fall. And we were right, because there was fundamentals that were positive in that. So that's why modeling these type of tools are very, very important. So Carlos will explain this in detail, but this is basically we have it for wheat, for hard wheat, soft wheat, for corn, for soybeans. For rice, we cannot do it because there is no future market in price. On price transmission, I will just bring some results and ideas, and Nick will go in detail. But basically, we use time series here. And we have tools set up in time series that you will be able to access to be able to analyze how much of the transmission is happening. So we use vector autoregressive models, and we use vector error correction models to be able to capture the transmission. Now, what was the limitation for us? Is that you need data. You need long time series. Okay? At the country level, but also within the country by commodity. And sorry, but in 2007-2008 it was very difficult to get a data. Today is improving a lot. But that's where you guys have to also be our ears in the field and be able to collect those data for your country. Because this is very important to give advice to a country. If you want the central bank or the Ministry of Finance to make policies, or the Ministry of Agriculture, they need to know what will be the transmission of those prices.
Just one point, and tell you what inputs response analysis and the rest of composition.
Yeah.
So directly in the results.
Exactly. Now look at the results. This is for Asia, for example. This is for rice, which is for wheat, sorry, and for rice in the other side. Look at the difference of the transmission across the different countries. You see how different it is? So assuming that there was transmission of one was a big mistake across all the countries. There was significant difference across the different countries. And the same for the case of rice. And for suppliers, for producers, here rice was very important. So understanding the level of transmission is pretty important. That's why we have a session on transmission. And this is for Africa. Just focus on the bottom one. Basically what we wanted to see is long-term relationships from international prices to national prices. These are the prices where we find some relationship for maize, rice, sorghum, and wheat, okay? For all those countries that we work. And look at the percentage where there is significant transmission. The most important one is rice, and the reason is mainly imported. Okay? For the case of maize, it's only 10%, sorghum 25%, wheat basically 0. So the level of transmission across commodity is very important. So if they tell me the Russian crisis will have affected many of the sub-Saharan African countries, I will say no. It will affect North Africa, Egypt, for example. Okay, so that is very important to understand to be able to to see what will be the effects at the country level. In terms of the welfare impact of changing in prices, you know that the poor are the ones who consume most of their budget in food. 50 to 70% of their budget is in food. But the problem is not only that, is that they will also, to respond to that increase in prices, deplete their assets. And when you have too many shocks, consecutive shocks, then you can go into a significant poverty. Okay? And you can affect the education of your kids because you make them work more in the field to be able to recover for the price loss. And you can affect your diets, and that will have long-term consequences. So we took an example here. For example, I mentioned in Guatemala, Peru, and Bangladesh. And look at the distributional effect of a 10% increase in domestic food prices. Most of the distribution will be negatively affected. Okay? And the average income loss will be around 3 to 4% for those countries. But the important thing is this negative shift.
So,
Yes.
the 90-something percent, is it of the total household?
No, these are the 20 of the poorest households. So it's, yeah,
For
20% of the distribution.
Okay.
So if you go to the higher, to the richer ones, it will be a lot lower.
Yeah, because I saw you duplicate Guatemala 97%, 20 forest 94. So it means for the whole of Guatemala is 97.
Yeah. For the whole Guatemala is 97.
Wow.
For Peru is 97. For Bangladesh is 91%. It's huge because you change the distribution. Now, if you look at calorie intake, for example, this is the average percentage of calorie intakes. In Guatemala, we find a reduction for the 20 poorest of -8.7. In Peru, 18.7. Now, if you, and also we have the data for Indonesia done by Scofield. So basically, this blue line is the distribution pre to the shock, and the red line is how the distribution will shift in terms of calorie intake. Now, if you look at the richest, what we see is an increase in calorie intake because they are consuming cheaper products that have more calories, and the poorest are consuming less calories. So also have an obesity issue behind. On the export bans. On export bans and restrictions. Normally, what we have seen, and there is a paper by Martin and Anderson and also by Boe and Laborde, is that changes in trade policies contributed substantially to increasing prices. That was in the 74s, it was also in 2008. Especially in rice, it was extremely important because of the few countries export. But the other issue which is important is that import taxes on countries or import restrictions in countries which are significant importers. So if I reduce the tax on imports and I am a big importing country, I will also put pressure over the supply. So it's not only an issue of putting restrictions to export, but we also need to look at the import side. If big importing countries reduce their import taxes, they will have a similar effect because they will put the similar pressure than increasing or increasing export taxes or putting export bans. Okay? So for example, China was facing a problem in the wheat corridor of drought. Okay? If China, because of that, shifted to become a significant importing country, then we will have a big problem in wheat. Thanks God they were able to resolve it with pumping and many technologies to pump, but it still is not too clear. In July we will know perfectly. So the symmetry between export bans and import bans is very important. We need to look at both. Okay? Normally we focus a lot on export part, but we don't look at the import side. Futures and spots. This is just a simple graph showing the relationship for the different commodities. The blue line is the spots and the red line is the futures. They look very similar, no? But that doesn't mean nothing. It's basically levels and they look similar. If I do oil prices and commodity prices, they will look very similar.
Is of the futures prices that the spot prices?
We don't know. You cannot conclude that from the graph. You cannot conclude nothing from it. You have to look at changes. You cannot look at levels and argue that there is causality or there is relationship here. You just look things moving similar.
Exactly.
And people, when they look at the commodity prices and they look at the oil prices, they immediately think everything is because of oil.
But
when you look at changes, you don't find anything.
When you look at integration, you look at levels.
Okay, so what we do here is we try to look at Granger causality, which is Granger causality. At the end of the line, Carlos will correct me if I say causality. The only thing we're doing is looking at Granger causality. Okay, so I can only argue that Granger causes something. And we look at the changes and see how much we can explain and what explains what. Okay? This is important because what we wanted to know. Yeah. And we wanted to know how much the liquidity going in the futures market was affecting the spot market. Think of a central bank. No? I can put more money and increase velocity without changing the amount of production. I can increase velocity and that will increase it. So we wanted to see if there was transmission from the futures to the spot. And this is the result we got. So basically, what happens to be happening, these are the number of lots we use. And we did this parametrical and non-parametrical. Basically, it appears that future prices granger cows and spot prices. Okay, all these were significant in the parametric model. In the non-parametric model, we had to reduce the lags because there were fewer observations. But that's what apparently is happening in all the commodities.
Just one simple question, because I used to work on these issues. If you change the frequency instead of using weekly, this daily, and monthly, it doesn't change the results.
No, we use it weekly and we use daily data to be able to show in what we say. So in the paper that you will be able to download, you have all the robustness checks behind the data. And that's why we also play with different lag levels behind. But this was a very strong result, although it's granger causality, because it basically allows us to understand this problem of how much the liquidity of the futures market was affected. Remember that in the futures market, only 5% of the transactions get realized. What that means that there is a delivery of the physical.
It's 5%, up to 9%. Yeah.
It's right. Yeah. But imagine, no? So 95 or more never happens. It's just the market going around and opening and closing positions. Okay? So if there is this increase in velocity, that could be influencing prices. Which doesn't mean it's bad, but we have to be careful and we have to look at it carefully.
Excuse me. This causality, is it both in the both sides?
Yeah, that's why you test. One hypothesis that you test is how much futures returns does not granger cause spot returns. That's one side, and this is the other side. Spot returns does not granger cause futures returns. This is the one that came out significant.
That's what we call bidirectional causality.
Okay, so the one that says that future prices granger cause spot prices was the one that came significant rather than the other. Now, the interlinkages within exchanges. Okay, what I mentioned before. Why is this important? And this requires several techniques to be able to do it. So we use the full T-back model, the diagonal T-back model, and the constant conditional correlation model to be able to understand what was happening between the exchanges. And we focus on the US exchange, the Chicago, the Euro-France Matif, the China, the Tokyo one, and I think we took also in some of the analysis the South African one. And this is exactly what I was telling you, what happens if I control one but don't control the other ones. Okay?
It's volatility or volatility.
Volatility. So we use impulse response function.
And which
here.
software did you use for that? You use
No, it was program. No. Okay, so what we find here is that the correlations between exchanges are positive and clearly significant for the three agricultural commodities that we were looking, which means that there could be some volatility transmission. And when we do the impulse response function, we see that it's transmitted across exchanges. So if I regulate the Chicago and I don't regulate the European one, all the transmission will go to the European one because the Chicago is too costly to move in. Okay? And even it could go to the South African one if I also regulate the European one. Now, what is the policy implication for that? Is that you need to argue that if you want to use regulation and be an effective tool, it needs to be harmonized across different exchanges. And that is a nightmare. Bringing all the exchanges together, which have their own benefit cost analysis because they don't want to be regulated, to reduce the liquidity, reduce the fees they will get. But also to coordinate across them is kind of a nightmare. And that's what they are trying to do now with the G20 and the G8. But I don't think it will work. So the effectiveness of the regulation instrument that I have needs to take into account these interlinkages. If not, it will reduce significantly.
So one question, does the order variables matter in that case? Suppose you know that A is affecting B and B is affecting C. So you have to put A, B, C.
Yeah, so for example, here you have interactions between the Chicago exchange and the European market is the highest among the exchanges considered for corn and wheat. So for each commodity, you have to look what is the relationship that is moving. In the case of indicate that China's wheat market is barely connected with other markets.
Because if you have your AGRODEP expectations, so you have to increase that one by.
Okay. So let me finalize before Bettina kills me. So first thing is markets are interrelated. That's very important. We're looking at global markets. Okay. the assumption that I can resolve the problem at my country level is not correct. It could be that I can resolve it in the very short term, but then it will create significant imbalances at my country level if I only think in that way. We need to improve information to handle volatility. We need more and better information on the stocks. That's a big problem. And what happened with the rush and the lack of information on the stocks was important. There are some numbers of stocks, but the quality of the data is very low. For example, we don't know what is the level of stocks in China of each of the commodities. And the Chinese will tell you it's a secret of the state. And they have it regionally. Even for the government, it's very complex because it's decentralized. So some regions have certain level of stock that they even don't know, and they try to do audits to build that, but that's a big problem still. And many countries don't want to share that information. And there is an effort to try to move this forward. And there is also a lot of private stocks. Not only traders, but also big farmers have their own stocks. So capturing that is very complex. We need to improve the models on these extreme spikes that Carlos will explain. And we need to develop models to link food and demand supply with international policies, prices, water sustainability, and climate change. That conceptual framework that links all the elements, I think, is very important to understand and work on. Okay, so we have a portal where all this is uploaded, which is linked to AGRODEP portal, where you can get all these models and tools to estimate. So it's called.
Do you also have the GUS programs for that?
We can share that with you.
Okay. Because I'm working on a paper, perhaps you can join me. It's for the crisis, what happened prior and after the crisis.
I can put you in contact with you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.